Over the past couple years, I've been interviewing exorcists, psychiatrists, and other exorcism experts. Some of the stories they tell are wild.
I've witnessed these things, so...
You've witnessed someone crawling up the wall like a spider.
Absolutely.
I went to see a guy that was at a halfway house up near Kentucky, and I just in the opening prayer, it wasn't even a prayer of deliverance. It was just, come Holy Spirit. And with that, he just levitated right up off the couch. Imagine you had a rope tied to your belly button and was pulling you up off the ground, and your limbs are just flung backwards. It was like he was being pulled up through his core, and everything else was just flailing backwards.
But he was on the couch?
Well, he started on the couch.
He started on the couch, and then he kind of like got pulled forward?
No, up. He was up in the air with his limbs hanging.
Every now and then, we'll get atheists and skeptics sort of respond to these interviews in the comments. This is as real as water dowsing. And next week, we have a real-life Bigfoot hunter. This is the sort of stuff that makes it hard to take apologists seriously these days. There's some good philosophy, exegesis, etc. on this channel. Why muddy it up with this trash? What a load of garbage. What a load of rubbish. I can't believe people are literally this dumb to believe in demons and crap. Smiley face. Fortunately, a genetically modified skeptic, or Drew, recently invited exorcism expert Dr. Joseph Laycock on his channel to provide a more academic response to exorcisms from a sort of naturalistic perspective. Now, I've been thinking about this subject a while now, and while I definitely appreciate the way that Dr. Laycock handled himself during the interview, seems like a super nice guy, I ultimately found some of his answers a bit underwhelming. So I thought that I'd invite my own expert on to offer some healthy pushback. The expert that I invited is Father Carlos Martins, an atheist convert to Christianity who now operates as a Catholic priest, and he's got extensive experience as an exorcist himself. And by the way, I actually invited another exorcism expert that could only join by phone toward the end of the video. That interview contains some insane new information that I've actually never heard before, so you definitely want to stick around until that point. All right, let's dig in. So in the first clip we'll be reviewing, Drew's expert, Dr. Laycock, explains his sort of overall approach to exorcisms when teaching his class at university. So we'll play the clip and then we'll get Father Martin's response.
Yeah, I mean, when I teach a class on exorcism at Texas State, this is something I push my students on, is I'll say, well, demons aren't real, so it wasn't demons. Right? And to go, okay, but let's go further, right? There's more to explain here.
Actually, I wanted to pause right here and ask you, I mean, this is an initial comment that he makes, but he says that when he starts teaching this class, he tells his students, we know that demons aren't real, but let's think more about this. I mean, he's kind of going in with this presupposition that demons don't exist.
So my initial comment is you can't have it both ways. You can't present yourself as somebody critical, a man of rationality, perhaps a man of science, although I don't know that he's claimed that label, but de facto, this presentation is one that is asserting that, in the sense that he's dispelling the kind of shaman, kind of folk understanding of the spiritual realm as being a realm equivalent of leprechauns and fairies and things. But you can't begin with the non-existence as your premise and still claim to be a person of rationality, because you haven't established that.
To kind of build on Father Martin's concern here, imagine that we were investigating whether there's life on other planets. Someone comes along and says, well, we know that there's no life on other planets, so let's kind of think more about what might be going on here. Well, I mean, hold on. I mean, why should we go in assuming that there's no life on other planets? Like, isn't that precisely what we're trying to investigate here? If atheists want to convince theists that exorcism accounts like the ones I've covered on my channel don't involve anything supernatural, they got to do a better job than merely assuming that demons don't exist. We'll actually be talking more about this later on in the video, so let's continue with Dr. Laycock's comments.
So Brian Levac was a historian at the University of Texas, and he studied early modern demonology and witchcraft. And he is kind of agnostic about, okay, if we want a naturalistic explanation, is this simple fakery, which lots of people in society might have motivation to fake being possessed, or are they truly experiencing being possessed because of mental illness or any number of other things and so forth? What he does conclude is whatever is happening, though, this is what he calls a cultural script. So before anything else, someone has to learn from their culture, what does a possessed person look like? How do they act? What are they supposed to do? And he noticed very early on, possessed Catholics don't act the same as possessed Protestants.
Right.
There are different things that they do. So once you realize it's a script, then what becomes the question is, where are they getting the script from? Who is training this person what to do when they're possessed?
Interesting.
Yeah, so one of the claims that he makes here is that Catholics act different than Protestants when they appear to be possessed. Is this true in your experience as well?
No, not at all. Neither a Catholic nor a Protestant nor a Hindu nor a Muslim. There are demons coming from different cultures that will have a personality that is reminiscent of that of the culture from which the victim comes. For example, I have witnessed somebody who was from India who was a Hindu that was possessed, and the demon mimicked the bodily postures. During the possession, there would be bodily postures that would be reminiscent of a yoga position, for example, or of a kind of a position that you would have a Hindu god taking. That doesn't follow from there that demonic manifestations or alleged demonic manifestations are entirely culturally conditioned. Demons have personalities, and because of those personalities, when they have a jurisdiction of a realm, that personality comes through in that realm. So again, you haven't established your position. You're taking note of certain sociological phenomena, and I'm not conceding that their position is accurate. I'm not buying into it. But okay, you are claiming that there's this sociological phenomena, that there's a difference between the two. They haven't established it, but they're claiming it. That is far from establishing your case that all of this is just a human expression.
Another thing that he says is sort of from a naturalistic perspective, there's only really two options on the table. It's either fakery or there's some sort of like mental illness going on. Do you see those as the only two options?
Well, obviously not. I'm an exorcist myself. The third option would be that demons are causing the phenomenon. You can't sit back and look at a situation and diagnose a person without actually testing them. Like, we don't do this in medicine. We don't do this in mental health. We don't do this in exorcism. So to look at a video, for example, that you see of an alleged deliverance session happening, you don't have a basis to conclude that is fake, that what's happening is fake, based merely on the video alone, right? Look, the American Psychiatric Association publishes the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which the current edition was just released. It was either late last year or earlier this year. And it's the most widely accepted psychological resource that's used by clinicians, researchers, and so forth for the classification of mental disorders and just mental states. And it's often been called the psychology Bible. So the DSM regards possession states as fact that lack full explanation and are subject to cultural interpretation. Mm-hmm. So the DSM presumes that such possession states are speculative, dissociative, or psychotic in nature, rather than rooted in spiritual evil. However, it doesn't go any further than positing that. In other words, it doesn't even address or mention Christianity's success in liberating persons from possession states over the past 2 millennia, where oftentimes science has left the person in no further state of healing. So here's a quote. This is from the current edition. This is from page 332. Possession typically manifests behaviorally as if a spirit, supernatural being, or outside person has taken control, with the individual speaking or acting in a distinct different manner. For example, an individual's behavior may give the appearance that her identity has been replaced by a ghost. But here's the kicker. The DSM admits that such a state of possession is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance like a drug or to another medical condition. So if it's not induced by a drug and it's not induced by an illness, by a pathology, then what induces it? And here, the American Psychological Association just goes quiet. So there is, now this is far from they admitting on their part that what Christianity has posited as spiritual evil existing, that they don't do that. Nevertheless, they are not discounting it, such as this individual in the video is discounting it. I mean, there's some intellectual honesty here.
I want to go back to one of the previous interviews that you and I did together. I mean, you say, and I've heard this from every exorcist, there's a process that you go through when you're trying to come to the determination whether or not someone is suffering some sort of mental illness or whether they are in fact possessed. And you even mentioned explicitly one of the tests that you've done with I think you said he was a firefighter. You were in your office with this guy. You were kind of distracting him by putting books on this desk. And then you had a cup, which appeared to just be an ordinary cup of water. But in fact, it was holy water. And you were distracting him with these books. And then at one point you were going to put more books on the desk and you dipped your finger in the water. You dropped a drop of the water on his back on top of his clothing. No way that he would have known that anything dropped on his back. And you say in the video, in the interview, you say that he sort of jumped out of his chair and hissed like a cat. And so one of the questions I have was what explanation would that fall under? Would that fall under fakery? And in that case, how would he be faking that? And then mental illness, like how would a mental illness explain his ability to detect some sort of, drop of water on top of his clothing? So to me, it's just like, these are the sorts of testimonies that we're receiving from exorcists. And I don't think, it just doesn't seem to me like these two options, fakery or mental illness, are really going to be doing enough explaining here. I mean, maybe you can sort of elaborate on this.
No, I completely agree. And we do encounter people who are fake. And why would somebody come forward and say in a manner that is lying, hey, I'm possessed by the devil? Well, because people are people, and there's all kinds of people that are lonely or that just crave attention. And to have an exorcist be looking at them fits a kind of script of comfort that they have written for themselves. They feel good about the attention they're getting. They feel good about, I have this exorcist that I've seen on TV ministering to me, and gives them a kind of sense of power and satisfaction that they're craving, that there's an innate craving to be the center of attention. But you know what? Those individuals, they don't last very long with an exorcist, because again, if supernatural evidence is not present, right, the ability to know unknown languages, the ability to know hidden events, and a demonstration of supernatural strength, if those things aren't there, then you send the people who, like, we don't, I mean, what they need is a doctor, or what they need is to go get a hobby. Like, this is not something that goes on indefinitely. Like, for 18 years, we're dealing with Mrs. Shephouse, who claims to possess a spirit, although we don't ever see evidence of a spirit. That doesn't continue. The relationship with the exorcist. I might. One of the things I do is I have a Betty Crocker recipe for cupcakes that I pulled online, and I rendered it into Latin. But poor Latin. I used Google Translator to render it into Latin. But the word for cupcake is very close to the word to Christ. So it can sound like you're saying something religious, and you're just reading off this recipe. Right? And so if there's a manifestation while you are reading this recipe, then that gives you a lot of information, because there shouldn't be a manifestation as you're reading this recipe. Right, so that gives you already an evidence that this person is following a script, that there's fakery involved here, or there's mental illness involved here. And nevertheless, look, because somebody is mentally ill, it doesn't mean I'm not interested in helping that person. Right? Somebody comes to me for help, I want to leave them in a better place, no matter what it is. Now, if it's just outright fake, if they're wasting my time, well, I make quick work of somebody like that. But if it's somebody who is wounded at some level, well, my job as an agent of Christ is to be a healer. And I might not be able to give them the help they need, but I will do my best to point them in that direction and to walk with them as they go in that direction and see if they don't get into a better place. Look, an exorcist, if he's worth his salt at all, he's developed a repertoire of techniques and abilities, of best practices to get to a point where you can isolate. Are the claims that this person, that this alleged victim in front of you is making, are they grounded in reality? Is there evidence that they're grounded in reality or not? And if the evidence just isn't there, then we end the relationship.
So when Drew's video initially popped up on my YouTube feed, I got a little bit too excited. I saw that he was covering the topic of exorcisms, and I immediately wondered, like, is he going to be responding to some of the content that we've produced? And I got even more excited when I started the video and I saw that one of my interviews popped up at the beginning of his video. So the clip of ours that he chose to comment on was actually from my interview with psychiatrist Dr. Richard Gallagher, who was actually skeptical of demonic possession at the beginning of his career and then became convinced after dealing directly with several possessed patients. So in the clip, Dr. Gallagher explains that one of the patients he worked with levitated according to 8 or 9 what he calls salt of the earth people. Let's watch. Is Julia the one where she levitated during an exorcism?
Yes. And again, I have talked to, and of course it's been reported all throughout history, not just in possessions, by the way, but also by occultists and sometimes even in the lives of saints. The question is, does that, in the lives of saints, does that come from God or does that come from some kind of demonic trick? That's a whole nother controversy. But the fact of the matter is, 8 or 9 people, including a couple of nurses and salt of the earth people, as well as the 2 priests, obviously, they all swore to me that for a half an hour during the exorcism, which was quite dramatic. She had several exorcisms. This was the last one. Quite dramatic. She was speaking foreign languages. The room became cold. The room became hot. And for about a half an hour, all these salt of the earth people told me that she levitated out of the comfortable chair that she was being held down on for about a half an hour, for about a foot off the air. They were convinced that if they didn't hold her down, which was very hard, and they were sweating to hold her down, that if they didn't hold her down, she would have risen to the ceiling or something.
Okay, now obviously this is a very dramatic story. But Dr. Gallagher claims that 8 or 9 salt of the earth people saw this woman levitate out of her chair for 30 minutes. That's a pretty long time to watch someone like break the laws of physics. I've never seen anything like this myself. So even I, like as a Christian, I approach these sorts of stories with a healthy dose of skepticism. But what I was really interested to hear is what Dr. Laycock had to say in response to this story. Like, what is his natural explanation for what Dr. Gallagher was describing here? Were the 8 or 9 witnesses lying to Dr. Gallagher? Did they experience some sort of group hallucination? Is Dr. Gallagher himself lying? Like, what's going on here? To my utter disappointment, neither Drew nor Dr. Laycock addresses any of these questions. Instead, they begin discussing the thesis of Dr. Laycock's book, where he attempts to explain exorcisms in terms of the cultural influence of movies. Let's watch their reaction, and then we'll invite Father Martins back on to comment.
That if they didn't hold her down, she would have risen to the ceiling or something.
So it's time to talk about the title of the book and what it is named after. You talk about this feedback loop that you call the Exorcist effect in the book, The Exorcist Effect. What is that feedback loop?
Well, so horror has always sort of insisted that this is based on a true story, right? I mean, going back to the very beginnings of the genre in the late 1700s. And so if you want to make a horror movie, you kind of have to tell people this is real, or it's based on true events, and so forth. And with William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, it was based on this case that happened in Maryland and then in St. Louis. When we looked into it, it's actually mostly from his imagination, but the conceit of it's based on this one case and things like this could really happen, that really captured the imaginations of people. And what it's hard for people who are not baby boomers to understand is that when The Exorcist came out in 1973, the whole country lost their minds. I mean, people were fainting in movie theaters and vomiting. And I show this movie to my students, and they're like, "This is corny.
It's
like,
pretty
this
mild,
is,
yeah.
This is MST3K, right?" So of course that inspired other people to believe, well, am I just feeling anxious or am I possessed, right? And so they go to the Catholic Church and they want to get an exorcism, and just like in the film, the church doesn't know what to do. That's not something that they do anymore. But then they start going to the Pentecostals and the evangelicals. And so the Catholic Church changed its calculus. They said, well, we've been suppressing exorcism in America because it's embarrassing, but now we're going to lose people because we're not doing the exorcism. So the church really flips on this, right? And then as they flip on it, you start to get more exorcisms, right? And then some of those are spectacular, like the one that Gallagher is describing here. And so then people swoop in to get the movie rights, right? So Father Gabriel Amorth was kind of single-handedly responsible for exorcism gaining some traction again in Rome in the Curia, and he said, my favorite movie is The Exorcist, and he was a priest before that movie came out, and then he got into exorcism. And as we were writing the book, they announced that Russell Crowe is now going to play Father Amorth in this totally ridiculous, silly movie that was panned by the Exorcist organization that he founded. But it is kind of ironic, right? It was sort of, you reap what you sow, right? You kind of made this almost Faustian deal with Hollywood, and now you've lost control of how it's presenting your religion.
So there's this vicious cycle between just horror stories and specifically horror movies and actual perceived, at least, cases of possession, exorcism, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And it's not that people don't know the difference between movies and real life, but movies are giving you models of things that might really happen, right? So almost everybody has probably been in an emergency situation or thinking about something that could happen, and somebody will say, well, that's only in movies, right? Like if someone starts having a seizure, right, unless you specifically train for this, you're probably going to do something that you've seen in a movie, and it might be the wrong thing, right? Or if you hear there's been a prowler spotted around your neighborhood, and you start thinking about self-defense, you're probably going to think of things that you saw on television or something like this. And so it's the same way with things about the supernatural, right? If you are up at 3 a.m. and you hear a noise that you don't recognize, your mind will start saying, well, you've seen models of this, right? And depending on your personality, you might say, well, that's absurd. It couldn't be that. Or you might say, gosh, maybe I need to talk to my pastor, or I need to talk to someone who knows about the spirit world. Maybe they can help me figure out what's going on. So they do affect the way people perceive reality, but in this kind of indirect way.
I've interviewed so many exorcists, so many people that have worked with exorcists, psychiatrists that are involved in this and stuff. And I just, the stories that I hear from them trying to explain all of that through cultural influence or through people watching movies, like what I'm looking for from an atheist would be something more akin to, okay, this priest is lying, and you'd have to, like, that's the explanation that you'd have to give. But that's hard. That's hard to do, because when you watch these interviews, the priests, like such as yourself, you guys seem sincere. You seem sincerely to report what you've seen, what you've experienced. So lying seems not a very good explanation, even though I think that's what a naturalist or an atheist, they'd have to go toward. For example, like when it comes to reports of levitation, that is not something that can naturally happen. And so an atheist has got to come up with some explanation of that. You see, I was interviewing Father Dan Rehill recently, and he was saying that this person levitated off of this couch, lifted up in the air, like his arms and legs were hanging back down, and he hung up there for several minutes. Like, how does an atheist explain that? What an atheist can't do is say, oh, well, this person watched The Exorcist, and so they went into this room and started floating. There's no connection there, right? You need to come up with a better explanation than that.
Well, sure. And you have people in the third world who have no access to movies, who don't have access to The Exorcist, who living in squalor. They've never watched TV other than walking past maybe a place of business that has an image on TV, like is playing a show or a news program or whatever. But so these people are not culturally inhabited with it by the American culture, by European culture, by Western culture that presents evil, a la the movie The Exorcist. And yet the phenomena exists in them. Now, I knew a priest. He was an old spiritual director of mine, Father Joe Kane, who lived in South America for over 30 years and functioned as an exorcist. And he's dealing with people living in the jungle, people who are very poor. I mean, he didn't only deal with such persons, but he's dealing with people who are in a completely different social situation than we are, in a different cultural situation. And the same phenomena are there present. You know, like I studied philosophy in school, in college, and you know, one of the things I found frustrating, like I studied, among other things, existentialism, and the existentialists deal with notions of the absurd and the human experience as being rooted in an experience of absurdity, that human life is condemned to desire an end and a purpose, and there's no objective end or purpose. I mean, this is a claim, and folks often they group Albert Camus in there as a philosopher, and that has always been a frustration for me, because Camus was a great writer. He was a novelist, and very interesting to read. But he begins with the absurd as his starting point. He doesn't conclude with it. So people will justify the absurd, or they'll quote Camus in not just describing the phenomena of the experience of human life being an absurd enterprise, but they will use him to buttress an argument and position. Well, Camus had no arguments for the absurd. He began with that as its premise. I mean, you've got to go beyond it. You've got to go to perhaps Jean-Paul Sartre, some other thinker, to get at an intellectual position and state it and defend it. But there's no defense of an intellectual position here.
So one of the things that I wondered about after speaking with Father Martins is whether it was true that the Catholic Church didn't really engage in the ministry of exorcisms prior to the Exorcist movie in the 1970s. So I called up my friend Adam Bly, a church decreed expert on religious demonology, who trains exorcists. He's witnessed hundreds of exorcisms himself, has even written a book on the history of exorcisms. So I asked him this question. The question that I've got for you, you've written a book on exorcisms and the history of exorcisms. Is it true that the Catholic Church didn't really take exorcism seriously, or they were sort of ashamed of the ministry of exorcisms prior to the movie The Exorcist that came out in the 1970s?
No, Cameron, that would be a tremendous oversimplification of things. So it depends on what century you're talking about. It also depends on what part of the world you're talking about. So if you want to talk about right around the 1970s, it is true that in the United States, there was a period of time where the priests were taught, mostly they were taught in the seminaries, a number I've spoken with, that exorcism and possession wasn't a real thing, and that they should just send people to their doctors if they have a problem. Now, that is no longer the case, and that wasn't the case in previous decades, before the late 60s and the 70s. And it was very much limited, for the most part, to here in the United States. So you got to be really careful whenever you say, quote unquote, the church, because the church is a global organization. So, for instance, South America, to my knowledge, has never stopped addressing possession cases with exorcism. Italy has always had a robust ministry of exorcism down through the centuries. And the church in general, for the most part, has always been active in this area from apostolic times forward.
Another lingering question I had is how Catholic exorcists go about ruling out natural causes. I've actually heard this explained before, but I felt like Adam could help provide a good, succinct answer for us. His answer was both very informative, as I expected, but it also contained some new stories I didn't really expect to hear. So how do exorcists go about differentiating between someone who is either faking demonic possession or they've got some sort of mental illness? How do they differentiate between people that are experiencing some sort of natural cause versus someone who's experiencing some sort of supernatural agent, possessing them or oppressing them in some way?
Yeah, Cameron, that's a great question. And this is something that the church was wrestling with as early as 1614, when the older exorcism rite was kind of standardized for the whole world. Now, there were exorcism rites before that, of course. It's just they weren't one fixed universal book for the whole world. But in 1614, they were already well aware, and they had been previous to that, they were well aware that most of these claimed possessions were either misunderstandings, mental illness, fakery, something that wasn't genuine. And so the church wanted two things done, and still does want two things done. The first is an outside medical kind of opinion on the case, where the person reports their symptoms to the doctor, and the doctor says, does this look like a typical treatable thing that is in our books, either in the ICD-10 or DSM, within the medical books. And if it is, we ask the person to cooperate with treatment, whatever that might be, and see if that takes the symptoms away. That's a kind of common sense approach. There's great harm that can be done if you kind of endorse the spiritual hypothesis about a problem without ever exploring the much more likely potential that it's just a medical thing that needs to be treated. So if you jump to that spiritual hypothesis, you can leave something untreated. For instance, a brain lesion of some kind or a tumor that's causing strange experiences. Well, let's say you leave that untreated and it turns out later it was cancer. Well, now you've done a great harm by not having the person check out the medical first. Okay, so that's kind of the first hoop and I think it's a moral thing to do. It's the first hoop the case has to go through. The second one, it's not enough to say, well, the doctor can't explain it. That doesn't mean, moral certitude that the person's possessed. After the doctor basically can't explain it, you then need to find some of the classic signs of possession, and those are the following. The first and easiest is knowledge of all languages. So, developing schizophrenia doesn't make you suddenly fluent in ancient languages. And I mean all languages. Like, we had a person in Texas writing out sentences in Icelandic in a dialect from about 600 years ago. It took, considerable context to get it translated, and it was completely correct. And this person had never been to Iceland or studied Icelandic. That's just one example. Greek, Latin, other languages. I was involved in a case where a person with a high school education raised on a farm here in Pennsylvania correctly responded to English, French, Latin, Lithuanian, and German. The spirit knew all the languages, and more than just saying yes or no, like full sentences. So that's the first one. And you can't, there's not a mental illness that suddenly, makes you fluent in ancient languages or all languages. Secondly is knowledge of hidden things. So the most common one is the secret sins of the people that are present, or your secret attachment to sin. So maybe you've been to confession, but you have a strong pattern of falling to a particular sin. They will sometimes recite in embarrassing detail some of the worst sins that you've done, even things where nobody else was present but you, showing that not only they know about it, but they were present and watching, which can, that can freak some people out when they're new to this ministry. Now, sometimes that knowledge of hidden things is mundane stuff that isn't about sins, but is so specific that it really kind of, startles the person. So that would be number two. Number three would be detecting the holy. Now, of course, an atheist would say, well, you're holding up a crucifix. Of course, the person is going to cringe. Yeah, the church knows that. We don't do a test where it's obvious. So you might have 5 bottles of water that are identical, one that's been blessed before the person arrived, and the person every time can pick out the one that's blessed and say, that's the one I'm not going to touch that or drink that. I don't know why. You can do the same thing with 10 bottles, etc. You could sprinkle exorcism blessed salt on all the chairs except one, and when they arrive, and I mean just a few grains, you can't see it, they will always pick the chair that doesn't have it on it. This goes on and on, including more elaborate versions like being able to tell you the saint's name, whose relic is in your pocket, that you haven't mentioned to anybody or shown to anyone, different things like that. So that would be number 3, which is being sensitive to the holy in a preternatural way. Number 4, and it's the weakest sign in my opinion, is strength beyond their condition in life. Now, the reason I say it's weak is because in psychiatric settings, and I've spent a lot of years in forensic psychiatric settings with, the criminally mentally ill, including psychotic people that in certain states can demonstrate unbelievable strength for a brief period of time. What we see with the demonic is the strength never weakens. It's not an adrenaline rush. 2 hours later, they're still throwing 5 men around the room and they're not sweating often. And when the person comes out of it at the end of the session, they don't report any soreness. They're just confused about why everybody else is drenched in sweat and beat up. So that's the 4th one, is strength beyond their condition in life. So the church wants to see some of those signs, enough that are striking, to reach moral certainty that this is beyond explainable human stuff. Now, the only caveat to all that is the very rare stuff like levitation. If one were to see that, it kind of, once you confirm that, this isn't a gag, it's not a trick, that kind of seals the deal. So there was a case where a student in a school was in a principal's office, walking on the ceiling of his office in a demonic state. And, it was a Catholic school, and he called a priest friend and, said, you need to get down here. This is your problem. And the priest who was telling me this story was like, what do you mean it's my problem? He said, the student's walking on the ceiling in my office. So it's very rare, levitation. So that's not even really listed in the books because it's so rare. But I'm giving you an example of there are certain things that are so over the top that you reach moral certainty very quickly.
Something else we haven't yet talked about is that exorcisms clearly predate cinema. So the influence of cinema explanation, if it works at all, is going to be pretty limited in scope. It's not going to explain, for example, the very public and highly documented exorcisms of Nicola Aubry that happened in the 16th century. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'm actually planning more content on this case, but this exorcism is wild. I mean, according to numerous contemporary reports, Nicola underwent a copious amount of exorcisms from both Catholics and Protestants for a total of about 3 months. Over 150,000 people in total traveled and witnessed these public exorcisms. Among other supernatural feats, she was seen levitating 6 feet in the air on multiple occasions, while up to 15 different people tried to hold her down. And again, these events were witnessed by thousands of people, including historians, who came to witness the events themselves and then later wrote about them. Nicola was eventually freed from her possessed state on February 8th, 1566, after consuming the Blessed Sacrament. Interestingly, a number of Protestants attending the events, including a Protestant historian by the name of Florimond Idemond, converted to Catholicism after witnessing the power of the Catholic Eucharist over the demonic spirits. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, literally. We're going to be producing a lot more content on this case in the future. But so, yeah, I mean, the Exorcist movie in the 1970s is not really going to explain what happened to Nicola Aubry in the 1500s. I feel like I should also mention that this exorcism took place prior to the Rite of 1614, which sort of standardized the practice of exorcisms for the Catholic Church, and it prevented these sort of public spectacles of exorcism. Interestingly, prior to 1614, there was no universal rite of exorcism, so all kinds of practices were used and abused, including practices by non-priests. This all changed, and for a very good reason, after the Rite of 1614. Now, you might have watched this entire video and you still find yourself unconvinced. There's nothing you can do about it. You want more evidence. So in this vein, we'll end this video with a very wise message from Father Carlos Martins to all of you skeptics that are still watching.
Having been an atheist myself until I was into my 20s, what I did was I just made a deal with God. And a God that at the time I didn't believe in, and I felt silly making such a deal. But I saw people who were Christians, who were happy, who had a peace that radiated from them, and it was powerfully attractive. Like, they were different people. They had a tranquility about them that no one else had. I didn't get their worldview. I thought, to me, it was absurd at the time, because atheism for me was an intellectual conclusion. It wasn't a given. It was after a process of examining. Is there evidence that God exists? Is that an intellectually viable position? And my conclusion was no at the time. Nevertheless, I see these folks, and I know they're not stupid. I was in classes with a whole bunch of them, and I was taught by some of them. Some of them were the professors that I had, and they were nobody's dummy, and yet they didn't subscribe to what I subscribed to, but the exact opposite. And they lived their Christian life, not just in it as a devotee, but radiated it to the world. It permeated every aspect of their character. And you could see that. You could see a joy, you could see a tranquility. And so, when I got to a position where I just asked God, look, if you're real, and I don't believe you are, and I feel stupid even asking this, but if you're real, please reveal yourself to me. And if you can give me the faith that I see them, the joy, the tranquility I see in them, I'll give you my life. Because this will be the most real thing in reality. And you know what? God accepted my offer. And life has never been the same from that moment. So what do I say to an atheist? Look, on the one hand, I think that I sympathize with the atheist trying to get to an understanding of the reality of demonic possession and demonic influence and the Christian practice of exorcism, because at least insofar as the Catholic Church is concerned, we don't allow non-believers in the room when we have a session happening. We don't videotape, we don't record. We're not interested in defending the authenticity of this reality by convincing the non-believer. That's not our premise. Our premise is somebody is coming to us, a victim who needs help. That victim is the VIP. And our MO from start to finish is to help this victim. If you want to get in because, hey, I would like to see the levitation, or well, guess what? It's not going to happen, because it's not safe for you to be in the room, and it would be antithetical to the aid that we're giving this victim, because the victim is being made into a spectacle now. This is like we rather than being agents of God who are helping this person, we're using this, but we're exploiting this person in order to give an apologetic to non-believers. And that just, I think this is the wrong starting point if you want to investigate the truth of Christianity. I know that some are going to view this as a convenient way to excuse ourselves from putting evidence on the table. But our ability to be an authentic help to the victim supersedes that.